Okay, I just want to do a few examples on this delta math activity where you'll be given a graph and you have to determine which of the four given equations match the graph. So before I look at the example, do a quick little review on what you should be looking for. There's only four different situations you'll ever have to consider. So if we look at sine of theta or sine of x, we know it essentially starts at the midline and from there will either go up or go down. In this situation, because we have positive sine x, from the midline it goes up to the max. But if we had negative sine x, again starts at the midline and then goes down to the minimum. Well, when we compare that to cosine, cosine will not start at the midline. So here it's starting at the max and then comes down to the midline. But if we had negative cosine x, it starts at the minimum. So in a synopsis, sine always starts at the midline and based upon the coefficient. So if the coefficient was positive, starts at the midline. Let me go ahead and pull that one up. If the coefficient's positive, starts at the midline, goes up to the max. If the coefficient was negative, starts at the midline, goes down to the min. Where cosine, if the coefficient is positive, starts at the max. If the coefficient was negative, starts at the min. All right, so we'll look at the examples. All right, so here we can see that because it starts at the midline, we can narrow our choices down to sine. Second of all, the only other option it gives you now, we have to determine what the b is. So I'll pull this up and I'll work through an explanation. So let me do this. And there we go. All right. So right now we can see it starts here and a complete cycle goes all the way to 80, which means our period right now is 80. So our period right now is equal to 80. But we know period is found by doing 2 pi divided by b. So therefore 2 pi divided by b actually equals 80 in this case. So we simply will solve for b. What I'm going to do is create a proportion just to help work through it. So when I cross multiply, I get 2 pi is equal to 80b. Divide both sides by 80. When I simplify, I get pi over 40 is our b. So when we look at our four choices, there's the pi over 40 as your b. So what you don't want to do is get distracted by this x. So your objective, the math will be to determine what your b is. I'll do a different example. Otherwise, we can see here our midline is 0, and normally the midline is the constant. That's why there's no number out here. And we can see from the midline we had to go up 40 and down 40. That's why we have the 40 here is our amplitude. I'll do a couple more. All right, so from this graph, I can immediately see I'm starting at the midline and then I went down to the minimum. So I know I'm working with sine and I know the coefficient has to be negative. So here I really don't have to do any more work. This is the only option that I can choose from. But if I look closer, look at the constant term is -4 and our midline is at -4. From here I have to go up 2 steps and down 2 steps. That's why my coefficient is some sort of 2. I could work through the process of finding what my b is, but as you can see, all my b's are the exact same thing. So I'll look at another one. Here we can see the graph is starting at the maximum. So that means we can narrow things down to cosine, but unfortunately, all four of them are cosine. And the maximum, since it starts at the maximum, that means the coefficient has to be positive. So that narrows it down to either +5 or +25. Well, let's see. Our midline is 25. So we can see here the midline is 25 and it goes up to 30 and down to 20, which means we did an amplitude of 5. So when we narrow this down, we narrowed it down to the first choice and the last choice. The midline was 25. This is your midline. And we could see the amplitude was 5. So we've got the first choice. New problem, do a couple more. Here, again, this one's starting at the minimum. So this is cosine. Because it starts at the minimum, coefficient has to be negative. So our choice is between the second and the fourth. Then we could look at the constant term. The constant term is your midline. Our midline is 500. The 300 is the amplitude. 5, 6, 7, 8. 300 steps up. New problem. All right, this is a good one. Well, no, because I really want to practice the B, but all the B's is the same as what I have here. But we can see this is sine because it starts at the midline. Because it goes up to the max, that means our coefficient has to be positive. So it's between these two choices. Well, as you can see, sine with a positive coefficient. New problem. This one is pretty straightforward. Again, cosine because it starts at the max. And so the numbers. My midline is 100. So 100 has to be the constant term. Well, constant term 100, cosine as the graph. Couple more. I'm going to do one here. Let's look at this one because it has different B's. Starts at the midline, so it has to be sine. So all of them are sine. Our midline is 400. Look at that. All of them are 400. But the amplitude, because it goes up to a max, that means my amplitude has to be positive. So we've got sine. So it's one of these two choices. So the difference between the two is the B. So now we just got to work through what I did over here to find the B. So we know in this case the period looks to be from 0 to 160. So right now our period is 160. Well, 2 pi over b is how we find our period. So 2 pi over b is equal to 160. I'm going to do the same thing, cross multiply, but ultimately you'll see all you'll have to do is just switch some stuff around. But I'll go through the motions. That gives you 2 pi is equal to 160b. Divide both sides by the 160. And if you look back, all that's really happening, because once this crosses out, this right now says 2b over 160, 2 pi over 160 equals b. Compare this statement to the original one. Looks like all I did was switch the b and the 160. And yes, that's all you need to do. So when I reduce, I get pi over 80 is my b. So over here, pi over 80 is the b. So hopefully this will get you through this delta math activity.